Welcome to the second in the Iliad lecture series. Remember that these are review videos for the in-class lectures that we've had so far. So today we're going to cover the work that we did on the 31st and the 4th. Mostly the 4th. We're going to quickly cover the death of Patroclus and hopefully also the death of Hector. Then in the next video we will cover the very end of the Iliad. So let's go ahead and get started with the death of Patroclus. Now if you recall, up to this point in the Iliad we've had a lot of scenes of very intense violence. We've had several scenes of intimacy, specifically between Hector and his wife Andromache. And we've also had a good deal of wrangling, political wrangling on the part of Agamemnon trying to convince Achilles to rejoin the army and Achilles refusing. And we've also had a lot of wrangling on the part of the gods, who are also fighting, some of them on the side of the Greeks, some of them on the side of the Trojans. So there are a lot of sides in this conflict, but we're going to go ahead and examine the death of Patroclus because it is such a turning point in the story, and especially for this overarching theme of rage. So the first thing we're going to examine is what led to Patroclus's death. How does his death complicate, draw together, or lay bare the themes of the text? So just like we sort of examined the inciting incident for the Trojan War in the first place in the last video, let's think about this sort of chain of consequences in terms of the death of Patroclus. So the first thing we need to think about are these conceptions of identity. Now in this book, and I mean, we're looking at book 16, not the Iliad as a book, but the Iliad is made up of books. In this book, Patroclus has come to Achilles and begged him to rejoin the army because the Greeks are not doing so well. Their morale is very low, they haven't been winning a lot of fights, they had a really terrifying night where they had to stay up all night guarding these big signal fires because they thought the Trojans were going to come and attack them in the middle of the night. So they're not doing very well. And Patroclus knows that if he can get his best friend Achilles back out on the battlefield, that he can turn the tide of the war. Achilles says no. The best Patroclus can do is that Achilles lends Patroclus his armor to wear into battle to hearten the Greek soldiers, either believing that the Greeks will think that Patroclus is Achilles, or at least that if they see this very famous armor, maybe they'll see it as some kind of lucky charm. But it's more the first, because in a battle, in pre-modern fights especially, the kind of armor that you would wear covered you essentially from head to toe. It looked just like everyone else's armor. It made it very difficult to identify individual fighters, which is how we ended up with things like coats of arms. But Achilles has very special armor. His armor is very fancy, it's very beautiful, it was specially made. Achilles' armor is fully recognizable. So Patroclus wears Achilles' armor into battle, and that's when Hector sees him. So this brings up the question, would Hector have singled out Patroclus in the fight if he realized that he wasn't Achilles? If Patroclus was just wearing some regular armor, would Hector have noticed him? Would Patroclus have caught Hector's gaze? Would Patroclus have died if he was wearing his own armor and not Achilles? He might still be alive if he had just left well enough alone and put on his own helmet that day. But more than this, there's also this sense of hubris, of pride, of perhaps a rejection of fate, because on the way to the battle, Apollo, the god Apollo, comes to Patroclus and he says this: "Go back, Patroclus, back where you belong. Troy is fated to fall, but not to you, nor even to Achilles, a better man by far." But Patroclus was off, putting distance between himself and that wrathful voice. So Apollo specifically says, you are not fated to take Troy, Achilles is not fated to take Troy, so go home. But Patroclus thinks he knows better. He intentionally rides away from Apollo rather than listen to him. So in retaliation, during the fight, Apollo makes Patroclus's armor, Achilles' armor, fall off so that Patroclus is left standing naked and vulnerable to the spear of Hector. So there are a couple of things at play here. Did Patroclus die because because of mistaken identity, or because he was too identifiable wearing Achilles' armor? Did Patroclus die because of his own hubris and his rejection of fate in refusing to listen to Apollo? Did Patroclus die, perhaps, because Achilles refused to come out and fight? Because if Achilles had agreed to fight, Patroclus wouldn't have felt the need to put on his armor. So again, where do we lay the blame for these individual deaths? Where do we lay the blame for this war to begin with? So if we move on to the language of the death of Patroclus, we do see one thing that I want to bring our attention to, and there's a shift to second person. The majority of this text, the majority of the Iliad, is written in third person. So Patroclus did this, Agamemnon did that, Paris did this. But what we get here is a shift to second person, where the author, the narrator, addresses Patroclus directly. He says things like, "Yes, Patroclus, that is how you leapt upon Cebriones." And, "But when you made your fourth demonic charge, then, did you feel it, Patroclus? Out of the mist, your death coming to meet you." So shifts in point of view like this, where you go from third to second or third to first, they're always meaningful. They always have a purpose. Very rarely will you encounter a storyteller, an author, who does this just by accident. So what this reminds me of, and your mileage may vary, you may feel differently about this, you may have a different interpretation, but my personal interpretation is a lot like when you go to the movies and you're watching an action movie, you're watching, like an Avengers or something, and you see a character going into danger, or like in a horror movie, if the tension is high enough, you might hear around the movie theater people saying things like, "No, don't go in the basement," or "No, Spider-Man, don't do that." And so what this indicates to me is a heightening of tension. This is very much a high point of tension in the story, and the tension is so strong that the narrator has to call out to the character, because the emotions are running so high that he has to say, "Did you feel it, Patroclus? Your death coming to meet you." And so this would have a similar reaction, I think, on the ancient Greek audiences, where they're listening to this story, and then all of a sudden, the storyteller just busts out with, "Did you feel it, Patroclus?" And so they're going to feel this sudden shock of emotion and intention and terror. They're going to fear for Patroclus. So keep your eyes peeled for these little point of view shifts that clue us into the emotion of the text, the tension of the text, that will give us clues about where these moments of highest emotion are. So then we move on to the death of Patroclus, the moment of his death. And again, if we're thinking about this in terms of a film, this is kind of that absolute kind of highest moment of tension for this section of the story, and a breaking of that tension, because the moment of Patroclus's death sounds like this. Hector was watching this, and when he saw Patroclus withdrawing with a wound, he muscled his way through to him and rammed his spearhead into the pit of his belly and all the way through. Patroclus fell heavily. You could hear the Greeks wince. Throughout the text, we encounter over and over again these incredibly vivid, detailed, gory depictions of people's death. People getting stabbed in the neck, and people getting spears run through their chests, and fountains of blood, and just real kind of grindhouse kind of violence almost. But here, again, this is a very cinematic kind of moment almost, where the fight has been building and building, and Patroclus has been wounded, and Patroclus fell heavily. You could hear the Greeks wince. You can almost hear. It's as if this was a film, the music would be playing and building. You'd have this great kind of orchestral gathering of tension, and then the music stops. And the only sound you hear is Patroclus's body falling to the ground. That kind of crumple sound of someone falling in the dirt. And so again, think about what this would be like to hear. Think about listening to this story. You're holding your breath. Maybe you like Patroclus. Maybe he's one of your favorite characters. And then he's just gone. There's no... For as much description as we got of his approaching the battlefield, of his, fighting Hector, of his being wounded, of his losing his armor to Apollo's wrath, he just fell. That's it. So we're going to end this video here, and we're going to pick up with the death of Hector in the next video.